Hello, thank you for tuning in to this talk. What I want to try and do over the next 20 minutes or so is explain the work that we at Bournemouth University have been doing on Lake Farm Legionary Fortress, one of the earliest Roman forts identified within the country in the aftermath of the Roman invasion of AD 43. And if I can share my screen. Fantastic. I will, obviously my name is Miles Russell. I'm one of the co-directors of the Dura Triges project, which is looking at the Iron Age to Roman transition in Dorset and the southwest. And this particular aspect of the survey, the bulk of the survey work was conducted by Dave Stewart, who worked out during the survey. He walked well over 300 miles. Doing all that geophysics. Paul Cheetham, Aoife O'Reilly and Ashley Green also did significant areas of the survey. Harry Manley did a lot of the topographic work, and David John did the three-dimensional computer graphics that you'll see in this talk. I coordinated bits of the excavation, and myself, Paul and Dave have been writing various different reports on this. But suffice to say, when we're talking about Lake Farm as a legionary fortress, it's not overly well known, but it is the place of residence for the first named occupant, or the first known historical occupant of Dorset, the first one for which we have an identity for, Titus Flavius Vespasianus. He, of course, is emperor in AD 69. But earlier in his career, he'd served as a general for the Second Legion, the II Augusta. And his earlier aspect of his life was written down by Suetonius in the 12 Caesars, and he doesn't get an awful lot of detail relating to his campaigns in Britain, other than he fought a number of battles and took a series of towns. But it is recorded that he was there when the island of Wectis, the Isle of Wight, was captured by the Roman state. So we know that Vespasian is in charge of the Second Legion from the moment the Roman soldiers land in Britain in AD 43 to at least the point in which the Isle of Wight is taken, so that he's there overseeing the legion as it marches westwards across Sussex, Hampshire, and into Dorset. And that's quite important, I guess, because we don't know very much about the nature of the Roman conquest, about the tribes they interacted with, the winning over of hearts and minds, as well as the actual physical capturing of territory. We've got quite a number of forts identified further west as you go into Devon, especially around the fortress of Exeter. And we know quite a lot about the movement to Gloucester and to Usk and to Kelly in South Wales, where the Second Legion eventually ended up. But you'll see on this map, Lake Farm identified on the eastern edge of Dorset. Not much really known before that. Presumably not perhaps a lot of fighting going on between tribes, not a lot of resistance with tribes further to the east, given that most were broadly speaking friendly with Rome. But Lake Farm is one of those sort of critical points of the advance. Now, you'll be forgiven for not knowing anything about the site today, or at least driving over it without seeing it. If you go on the A31 westwards down towards Dorchester from London or from the southeast, you go on the southern margins of the town of Wimborne Minster. You're going across the floodplain. It's very, very flat topography. You'll see the two sort of towers of Wimborne Minster in the distance. And the last turn off to Wimborne, the B3078, which has got a nice little National Trust sign indicating to Kingston Lacey, is the Lake Gates roundabout. And the fort that we're going to be looking at in this lecture covers that broad area, but there's no surface trace today. It's been completely flattened, possibly by the Romans themselves, but almost certainly by later bits of agricultural attrition and general levels of damage. So the A31 today, not the most exciting bits of roads, but it's been a very nice scenery up to the Lake Gates roundabout. The fields, as I said, there's nothing really there. Surface remains wise to show where the fort was. There's been car boot sales and circuses and various different carnivals there over the years. So there's quite a lot of surface debris. But the site was first identified by Norman Field in the late 1950s. Norman was a school teacher and an amateur archaeologist, and a very talented one at that. and he surveyed and identified large numbers of Roman structures in and around Dorset. Published a lot of interim reports and short statements and so on, but his magnum opus in effect was the book Dorset and the Second Legion, which sadly didn't actually see the light of day until just months after he died, so we never saw the finished version. But in that, he identifies a series of roads and possible forts that the Roman army constructed on its advance westwards. And the reason that he was interested with Wimborne Minster and with Lake Farm in particular was because he identified the road going up from Hamworthy, from the area of Paul Harbour to the south, going upwards towards Wimborne, and then suddenly taking a dogleg and going off into the northwest direction. And that made no sense to him unless there was a road coming in somewhere from the east to join it, or unless there was some kind of fort or settlement or other Roman site at that point where the road suddenly turns. And in investigating there, he identified Roman activity. I mean, the A31 as such follows an old railway embankment as it comes through. So much of the site has already been covered. But in trial excavations and survey, he and a group of colleagues and friends found that Roman activity. So between 1959 and 1971, small-scale trial excavations trying to delimit the size of the area. Field suggested what we had here was a Roman fort, almost certainly a legionary fortress, with a series of internal roads, around about sort of 11 hectares. Now, rather sadly, I guess not sadly that atypical for the time, being an amateur, Field found it difficult for the archaeological establishment to treat his discoveries with any kind of credence. He was, let's just say, he was ignored by a lot of Roman military archaeologists of the period, who felt that this either wasn't a fort or it wasn't quite as great or significant as Field was making out. But in 1972, when part of what was now the A31 bypass was established and was expanded, Graham Webster of Birmingham University conducted excavations there with Norman Field on hand, and recovered a whole series of Roman military structures. You can see in the photograph there the foundations for a number of timber frame buildings, and later excavations when the road again was being expanded in 1979 to 81. By Ian Horsey and Keith Jarvis of the Poole Museum's archaeological unit, further defined the area of the fort. And by that stage, it was fairly clear what we were dealing with was a Roman fortress. Now, sadly, neither Field's nor Webster's, Horsey's or Jarvis's work has ever been published. I guess it's the sheer quantity of archaeological artifacts recovered and remains exposed that the post-excavation has never been completed. But Poole Museum and Wimborne Museum, amongst others, contain large amounts of boxes crammed full of material and drawings and sections and other data sets, which we at Bournemouth have been trying to go through and trying to make sense of as a preliminary stage of getting that report out there. Now, the great thing about the excavation at the time when it was done was it was supplemented by a large-scale geophysical survey, the first time that's really such a significant experimental series of surveys have been conducted. This was by Andrew David, Alistair Bartlett and Tony Clark of the Ancient Monuments Laboratory throughout the 1970s and early 80s. And the problem with the equipment at the time then, for anyone like myself who did do surveys in the 1980s, a lot of it involved sort of actually physically writing down information, programming into a computer, getting ticker tape results out, which you had to cut up and sellotape together and then photocopy for the end result. So although the results were good, it offered a lot of labor to try and get them into a presentable form and trying to understand them. So here's a series of strips that the AML produced, and you can see on the magnetometer survey there is a ditch running right the way down, if I get my cursor to go there, along here. And it's a case of then overdrawing on the top of that to try and make sense of that data set. And despite the fact that the technology is quite primitive, they did a fantastic job of locating ditches, identifying pits and internal divisions within the fort to generate this. They weren't able, given time and equipment constraints, to do the whole of the site, but you can see the outline of the fort here. You can see hopefully internal subdivisions. There are pits, there are features, there's a whole range of material going on. It's quite clear this was a Roman fort, rectangular with rounded corners of around about 12.8 hectares. We were very keen before we started doing any of our analysis of the materials there to do a new geophysical survey of the site, which is here. This is mostly the area that Dave Stewart walked his 300 miles. But you can see we've got the outline of the Roman fort. There's lots of internal subdivisions and pits and features and structures. And it's this I really want to try and focus on in the rest of the talk. Lake Farm, of course, is vitally important because it's one of the earliest legionary fortresses for which we have a plan of in the UK. The most complete plan up to this date is this site. This is Inchterthill in Pen and Kinross in Perth and Kinross in Scotland, excavated by Ian Richmond in the 1950s and early 60s. This site was abandoned before it was ever completed, but it's never been subsequently developed or destroyed. So the layout of the fort was pretty much all there to be investigated. And the thing that's important to be aware of when we're talking about legionary fortresses is that the legion itself is around about 5,200 men. So the bulk of the interior of any given fort is usually covered by barracks, by general accommodation. And it's just important just to stress, so I apologize about the image, about the nature of a legion. Although we've got about 5,200 citizens within a legion, they're not all legionaries. Some are orderlies, officers, scouts, and so on. But the legion itself can be broken down into nice definable units, which is vital when you're trying to understand the structure, or internal structure of a fortress. The lowest, sort of the smallest group, 8 men within a legion, forms a contubernium, which is a tent party. They occupy 1 tent on campaign or 1 room in a barrack block. There are 10 contubernia, i.e. 80 men in a century. So that the name century really applies to the days of the early republic when there was 100 men. During the restructuring, the numbers have changed as we go into the empire, but effectively 80 men, 1 contubernia. They occupy 1 barrack block in a legionary fortress. 2 centuries together form a maniple. Usually you see 1 barrack block facing another, so 160 men. And then 6 centuries, if I've done my maths right, 480 men is a cohort. And when you're looking at a Roman fort divided up into a series of islands, you can see where 1 cohort's barrack blocks are, and then the other, and then the other, and so on. The first cohort, the elite fighting men of a legion, is nearly double strength, so that's 800 men, and they've got the better appointed, better placed barrack blocks within a fortress. And there are 10 cohorts, including that first one, in a legion. So as I said, with the troops and other sort of officers and so on and orderlies, you've got about 5,200 to 5,300 at a push, but there's a lot of men to fit into a relatively small space, which is why when we're talking about Inchterthill in Scotland, it's about 21.5 hectares. It's a vast space, a square space in which the bulk of the interior is given over to barracks. The same with Cellian in South Wales, that becomes the permanent home of the II Augusta, 20.5 hectares. Lake Farm, as defined in the geophysical survey, is only 12.8 hectares. So it's only just over half the size of a permanent legionary fortress, which is why it's always thought it's not the whole legion that was stationed here. Perhaps it was just half. Perhaps it was a vexillation fort, so that half the legion, perhaps 2,500 men, were there. Perhaps the other half were in Oxfordshire or were in Chichester, further to the east, or perhaps more likely they were in a fort underlying what becomes Dorchester, further to the west in Dorset, with outlying little fortlets at Hod Hill and Wadden Hill. So that's the standard interpretation of the advance into Dorset if the legion was attacking individual hill forts, which it now appears actually they weren't. That's a bit of a controversial thing, but we won't. We're talking about the fortress here. What I want to try and do is focus down on the geophysical survey in the time we have left. So if we look at the northeastern corner, it's show. I mean, I love geophysics, and I love what the magnetometry survey is showing up here. You can see hopefully the ditch turning a corner and coming down. We've got the A31 sadly sort of covering over part of the section of the fort there, but we've got internal divisions and lines and structures within the fort. And the most obvious features, those straight lines subdividing space. Those aren't the roads, but those are the drains at the center of roads within the fort. It's a very wet area, as implied by the name Lake Farm. The River Stour floods quite a lot, but these drains we see a more permanent form. When you look at sites like Chester's up on Hadrian's Wall, you've got a barrack block either side there. There's a road running between them, and that drain is sort of there. And we can, that is effectively what we're seeing at Lake Farm, albeit perhaps a timber drain or just cut down through the road structure, but it helps identify where the roads were. Then we've got the ditch that defines the fort itself. And when this fort was abandoned, I think the whole structure was probably leveled. So a lot of material has gone back into the ditch. That's why it's showing up beautifully. The earth from the ditch was originally piled back to form a rampart, upon which we've got a timber palisade. Nice little reconstruction by David John. But what we can see in the rampart itself, hopefully in this red area, you can see these dark blobs with the white halos around them, indicate significant areas of burning. And the probability is what we're seeing there are ovens built into the earth rampart. One of the things that's missing in a lot of these forts, which when you compare to sort of more modern military installations, there's no canteen, there's no cookhouse. Soldiers are expected to cook their own foodstuffs. So to minimize the risk of fire, but also to better insulate the ovens to retain the heat, what we often see are these bread ovens or other sort of foodstuffs, food cooking areas dug into the earth rampart. This is the more permanent structures at Caerleon, the legionary fortress in Wales, but on the Lake Farm, these blobs almost certainly are following the inner line of the rampart, and they are ovens. So here we've got looking inside, we can't see the ovens on this particular reconstruction, but we've got the earth rampart, the palisade, and then the buildings. And as I said, the interior is mostly given over to barrack blocks. This excellent reconstruction drawing by Peter Connolly gives you that sense. If you've got a century, 80 men, we've got 10 rooms with 8 men each. In this reconstruction, they're in bunk beds, for which there isn't an awful lot of evidence, but unless they were all particularly friendly, that's one way of organising the space. But you've got a room at the back for the 8 men, a tiny room at the front for their equipment, 10 blocks of these, that's your whole century. And at the end is a little house for the commanding officer of that group, the centurion. And we can see that laid out on the ground again at Caerleon, this time in stone. There's a barrack block, the sort of 80 men within, and then the flattened, the larger bit at the end, which is like a flattened L, is the centurion's house. So that's your century accommodated there. And within Lake Farm, we can see those buildings quite nicely, actually. We've got a barrack block there for 80. Then there's a double one for 160. So 2 barrack blocks effectively stuck end to end with the entrances in opposite directions. Another double and then a single. So that in that one small section, that's effectively one cohort of the Legion. That's 480 men right there in those barrack spaces. And again, there's David's reconstruction, a 3D visualization, single barrack block, double, double, single. That's your cohort. And the interesting thing when we look at Lake Farm on the geophysical survey, there's that area we're talking about. There's the one cohort of 480. There's the next cohort and the next 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and a double. So effectively, although this is almost half the size in its footprint compared to later legionary fortresses, all the necessary buildings are there to accommodate the legion in its entirety. And you've got the tribunes' houses for the sort of junior officers, and then a central area there for the headquarters building and so on. So its footprint isn't as large, but this is the whole Second Legion. And we look at Inchterthil, the larger fort. Again, it's got all the cohorts and the tribunes' houses there, albeit there's more space. And I think that's the key here, is that Lake Farm was a campaign fortress. It's being established on the frontier at a time when the army is moving into unknown territory. So to try and minimize the danger, to try and reduce the area that needs to be enclosed, they've really crammed the troops into a much smaller space. So it's not perhaps as comfortable as living a space, but the perimeter is less required to actually defend it. You're reducing them in to make it a more secure point. And of course, the issue there is that if this is the legion in its entirety, and the dating seems to be from the earlier excavations from at least AD 45, then the likelihood is that Vespasian was here, he was living in this fort, he was commanding it when the legion was operating further sort of to the west. And that's nice, because when we look at the interior block away from the barracks and so on, we can identify where the headquarters building is, facing westwards out to the line of advance. And we can also from there deduce where Vespasian's house would be. And the slightly annoying thing is it's under the road. It's just to the sort of the south. You know, that is the position onto the left as you're facing out from the headquarters building. The A31 embankment goes over the top, following the line of the older road. So we don't know what was disturbed when the railway was constructed, but certainly there's no way of getting to that house now without disrupting the A31. And as a double whammy, as you can see in this aerial image, there is a bridge that connects two areas of pasture of the farm. And again, it goes right over the top. It couldn't be in a worse place for the commander's house. So we know Vespasian is the first named inhabitant of Dorset. We know where his house is. You just can't see it. But, you know, there you go. Hasn't stopped us reconstructing it, of course. We've got David's excellent reconstruction. There's the headquarters building. Next to it in the centre is a visualization, completely speculative, of course, of Vespasian's house, the commander's house. The fort, we know from the archaeological data recovered, is built around AD 45. It is abandoned in the early 50s, possibly 51, 52, whilst the legion moves to the west. And as is normal with legions, as recovered from a number of sites, anything they couldn't carry with them, they either demolished, but certainly buried. So the limited excavations to date have revealed a large amount of glassware and pottery and iron and material that's been buried in pits to stop the enemy getting hold of it. And that's quite nice, because there are a number of anomalies. I mean, given this site was been used by circuses and so on, it's quite possible a number of the anomalies relate to those. But there was a very big resistance, or very big anomaly, certainly on the magnetometry survey circled here. That's again those black dots with halos around, which could, in theory, be, I like to think of these, and there's no way of checking until that's excavated, but at Inchterthil, over 1 million iron nails were found buried in pits as the army abandoned the site. So I think, you know, this could be a similar thing here at Lake Farm. To the northeast of the site, another series of anomalies. Phil was quite clear. He thought the site comprised two distinct phases, and it does in fact look as if on the east side there is another ditch running slightly at an angle to the fort and then running under it, and it's a larger space. This could be a marching camp. Until that's been excavated, we don't know, but it seems to be an earlier phase. So perhaps AD 43, 44, there's a larger marching camp, or a camp to hold the soldiers whilst they then construct the campaign fortress. And circled, hopefully you can see there, is a roundhouse, or it's a round ditch. It could be a barrow, but it's a lowland area. I think it's more likely to be a roundhouse. But the question is, of course, whether it's Iron Age phase of activity when the fort's been abandoned, or whether it's immediately before the construction of the fort and is swept away. We won't know until that too is sample investigated. And then the road going out, the back door effectively of the fort towards the tower shows up beautifully in the geophysical survey. We've got ditches running either side of the road. Ignore that line coming down at a diagonal from the top right to the bottom left. That's a modern pipeline. But the pits there show this maybe a vicus or civil settlement, or some kind of constructional facility, some kind of workshops and so on, or store buildings between the fort and its river connection. It shows up nicely every time we get a particularly dry spring. In 2013, the ditches and the pits show up on that aerial photograph. And the area to the south, again, the other side of the roads, shows up beautifully on the geophysical. We've got these lovely ditch line which is running parallel and just outside the fort, And when we first saw this on the survey, we shoot, this must be the bathhouse. Every Roman fortress and some auxiliary forts have the recreational sort of rest facility of a series of baths. And this looked like that's what this could be. In fact, in our reconstruction, when we first put it together, there's the fortress. And then just on the right side there, you can see there's the bathhouse reconstructed. But sample excavation here, conducted 2 years ago, just outside the scheduled area, have shown this is actually a series of timber framed buildings and pits and workshops and lots of charcoal, lots of iron working. So this may be the part of the fabrica or external sort of workshops and so on. And then just to the southwest, we've got these lines of anomalies, which look like a native settlement. Could be late Bronze Age, could be Iron Age, could even be possibly post-Roman. We won't know until we sample that, but you know, there's a range of other things going on. And I'll just quickly end with this. I mentioned Vespasian is our first named resident for this area. Here's the second. This is a stone identified by Mike Trevarthen. It'd been used as a doorstop to the eastern end of Dorchester, and he photographed it and recorded it at the time. And it's a beautiful discovery, because it is actually part of a tombstone to Lucius Didius Bassus, son of Lucius of the Fabian voting tribe from Heraclea, from Macedonia. He's a veteran of the II Legion Augusta, who retired age 55. He died, and this is part of his tomb. So I suspect that this is somebody who retired from the Legion as it moved westwards, who lived and died and was buried on the outskirts of the newly developing town of Dorchester, but on the road that looks back towards Lake Farm, where his fortress would have been. And if that is the case, he served with Vespasian and probably inhabited one of those barrack blocks that we've now identified in the geophysical survey. So that's quite a nice little detail. The initial geophysical survey results have been published in Britannia in 2020, and a short report looking at the context, the topographical setting of the site, and trying to identify its name in the Proceedings of the Dorset Natural History and Archaeological Society, again in 2020. Hopefully this marks just the first stage of our work, looking at Lake Farm and trying to make sense of it and trying to bring together the various different excavation reports and specialist reports. But it's the first stage of trying to put Lake Farm effectively back on the map. Thank you. If you've got any questions, by the way, I'm more than happy to try and answer them.